Hello, I'm Esther Githui-Ewart. It's Wednesday, November 3rd. This is Africa 54.
Gunmen abduct staff members and their children from the University of Abuja. At the COP26 climate summit, African leaders call on wealthy nations to meet the $100 billion pledge. And diaspora groups in the United States fight for representation at the ballot box.
Nigeria is once again the scene of a major kidnapping. University of Abuja officials say staff members and their children were abducted on Tuesday. David Doyle has the story.
Gunmen abducted 4 members of staff and their children from the University of Abuja on Tuesday, the university has said. It is a rare kidnapping, taking place at such a large institution and in the Nigerian capital.
But my child is there in the bush.
Lecturer Basi Ubom says he escaped the violence, but that his daughter was taken.
3 of the boys were in front of my house shooting more than 20 rounds at the same time. I don't even know what is it, AK, what I call AK-47, those in the military. And there was no response.
Gangs of armed men, known locally as bandits, have launched a series of abductions from schools and attacks on villages since late last year. They are mostly in the northwest of the country, in exchange for ransom. While there have been kidnappings of individuals on the outskirts of Abuja, attacks on universities are rare. Abdul Rashid Nala, Vice-Chancellor at the University of Abuja, said security forces were immediately deployed and that a pursuit of the attackers was underway.
The truth is that this is one of the most devastating, incidences. It's becoming like a daily affair in this nation, and it's very sad that this great university is being attacked this way. It's very sad.
Meanwhile, Nigeria's security forces remain stretched on several fronts, including by the growing lawlessness in the north and northwest, and a 12-year Islamist insurgency in the northeast that has killed thousands.
David Doyle of Reuters filed that report. A joint investigative report by the United Nations and Ethiopia published on Wednesday reveals that all sides fighting in the war in Ethiopia's northern region of Tigray have committed violations that may amount to war crimes. The report accuses all sides of torturing and killing civilians, carrying out gang rapes and making arrests on the basis of ethnicity. The release of the report comes just one day after Ethiopia declared a state of emergency. Tigrayan forces say they might march on the capital to topple Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's government. The investigation was carried out by the UN's Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the state-appointed Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. The joint report did not determine the proportion of offenses by each side, saying investigators could not make an exhaustive list. For more insight on the joint investigation report by the United Nations and Ethiopia, joining us live via Skype from New York is VOA UN correspondent Margaret Bishir. Margaret, what more can you tell us about what you've learned from that report?
Well, first of all, Esther, some points about how the report was conducted. The investigators looked at the period of November 3rd, 2020, about a year ago today, from when the conflict began in Tigray until the end of June, June 28th, which is when the government declared its unilateral ceasefire. So they looked at abuses within that period. And they were able to travel to areas in Tigray, including Mekelle and other hot spots in the western and southern parts of Tigray. They also were able to see some areas in Amhara. And however, they said that they encountered a lot of security difficulties, operational difficulties, and administrative challenges in carrying out their work. However, they were able to interview about 269 people who had testimony to offer them.
And Just a few days ago, President Biden did talk about sanctions against some countries that will not be on the list of those who can be in AGOA. As we know, the African Growth and Opportunity Act. Were there any comments made about that on Ethiopia, Guinea, and Mali, which have had coups lately?
Well, the U.S. Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa, Jeffrey Feltman, spoke yesterday at a Washington think tank, and he said that this is a potential sanction. It hasn't been implemented quite yet, but they really want to see the parties stop fighting and come to the table. That's the main goal here. And Feltman warned that Ethiopia could really be sliding towards a civil war. That if the fighting now has spread beyond Tigray and into Amhara and Afar. And there's also the issue of other simmering problems, the Oromo and other tensions in the country. And if this all begins to flare at the same time, the country could see itself speed towards what he called a disastrous civil war that could last for 20 years.
Margaret, do we know? Go ahead.
I was just going to say a little more about the report. Just on some of the findings, it found that all parties attacked civilians and civilian infrastructure like hospitals and schools. They all carried out executions. There were some mass killings that the report cited of civilians. And we have heard a lot about sexual violence throughout this conflict, particularly at the beginning from women who are fleeing the area. And they did corroborate a lot of reports. And it wasn't, many of these women were gang raped. And it wasn't just women who endured sexual violence. There were men and young men too, and they cited one 16-year-old boy who was gang raped by 9 Eritrean soldiers and later killed himself. Oh. And I do think it's important to point out that the Ethiopian Prime Minister has said he has serious reservations about the report, but he accepted it, and he said he will set up a joint civilian military task force to look into the report's findings. The Eritreans, however, their forces are in Ethiopia. They said the report is utterly false. They reject the charges made against their soldiers.
Thanks, Margaret. VOA UN correspondent Margaret Bashir reporting live via Skype from New York. African nations at the COP26 summit are criticizing rich countries for failing to meet their promise of giving billions of dollars to help them cope with climate change. But agreements to protect rainforests and slash methane emissions were welcomed. Henry Ridgwell reports from Glasgow, Scotland.
The world's wealthiest nations, the G20, account for 80% of greenhouse gas emissions. But scientists say poorer countries, particularly in Africa, are suffering the worst impacts of climate change. Rich nations pledged in 2009 to give developing countries $100 billion a year to help them deal with climate change. But the target date has been put back to 2023. At the COP26 summit Tuesday, African leaders voiced their anger.
Those same nations are, however, insisting that we abandon the opportunity for rapid development of our economies. That would be tantamount to enshrining in the global community inequality of the highest order.
Their appeals failed to shift the timetable, but the frustration was tempered by progress on other vital climate emergencies. Over 100 nations agreed to end deforestation by 2030, backed by close to $20 billion in public and private funding. The signatories included Brazil. Deforestation has increased in the Amazon under Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro to its highest level in a decade, and some are skeptical of his pledge.
Mas isso não vai resolver o problema.
It won't solve social problems in our community where there is no water, where there is deforestation, where there is a river contamination. These are investments that will only give free rein to companies to keep their polluting.
Over 100 countries also signed a global methane pledge to cut emissions by 30% by 2030. Methane is 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide in driving global warming.
It's an incredibly important progress in addressing the climate crisis because we can now think about methane emissions separately from CO2 and recognizing that reduction of methane represents an enormous lever for making progress in reducing the rate of warming.
China and Russia, two of the world's biggest methane emitters, did not sign. There may be no big breakthrough at this summit, but organisers say the smaller, targeted agreements on protecting rainforests, cutting methane, or helping vulnerable island states all add up to significant progress. The absence of the Chinese, Russian and Brazilian presidents has led to questions over how effective the summit will be in curbing global warming. Host British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said he was cautiously optimistic. World leaders have now returned home. Their teams of negotiators will now decide the fate of the summit and, many scientists say, the future of planet Earth. Henry Ridgwell for VOA News at the COP26 summit, Glasgow.
For more perspective on what interests African nations have on the COP26 summit, I am pleased to be joined live via Skype from Nairobi by Kinyanjui-Koimburi, a scholar in agroclimatology, and he's also an energy expert and founder of the Climate Change Organization. What are some of the environmental changes you've seen in Kenya that are a direct result of climate change? I can't hear you. Check your audio. Mm-hmm.
Yes, sorry for that. Mm-hmm. And let me tell you something about Kenya and basically about Africa. Kenya, we have actually faced the impacts of climate change so drastically. And let me list a few. Droughts. Right now, Kenya, up to 2.1 million people are facing the impacts of droughts. Just recently, we were impacted by the impacts of floods. All the lakes within the Rift Valley, that is within Kenya, they were affected by floodings. And these have correlated very, very well with the surface or the rise in surface temperatures that we have experienced globally. And also we have seen the locust invasions. So climate change has actually resulted to some of these zoonotic kind of diseases and some of these pests encroaching into areas where they were drastically not seen previously, but now they are. So the impacts of climate change in Kenya, we have seen it firsthand. And just recently, a UN-released report showed that by 2050, all the glaciers found within the East African countries will be extinct by 2050. That is Mount Kenya within Kenya, Mount Kilimanjaro, which is in Tanzania, and Mount Rwenzori, which is in Uganda. So the glaciers are expected to become extinct by 2050. So this is one of the effects of climate change, and we are calling upon the government to scale up its effort towards ensuring that the people of Africa, and specifically Kenya, are not impacted by these, what we call climate change effects.
So, Kinyanjui, some critics of the annual global meeting that's taking place in Glasgow say the leaders have speeches, but they haven't really addressed the issue. From an African perspective, what do you see happening in Africa to address the issue of environmental damage and resulting from the climate change?
Thank you so much for that. And let me say it pains us a lot because you have seen in the COP26 just recently some of the top 5 polluters in the world not being able to participate in this important meeting. Here I'm talking about China, Russia, and Brazil. And yet they contribute up to 80% of the greenhouse gases emissions. When you talk about Africa, we only contribute up to 2 to 3% of the greenhouse gases emissions, and yet we are the ones who are supposed to participate more. They're the ones who are actually polluting. In Africa, we have done a lot in terms of ensuring that we move away from the emissions of greenhouse gases, and specifically Kenya is known globally. Kenya is ranked number 8, that is in the world, and also number 1 in Africa in terms of using green or geothermal energy. So this one tells you that Africa is doing a lot, but the foreign countries are not doing a lot. Just recently, we had Gabon being given around $17 million as part of the carbon credits. So this one tells you that we are actually pulling up our socks, but these developed nations, they are not playing their part. and yet they're telling us to cut our carbon emissions. And yet you can see in the Green Climate Fund, they have not yet even reached the 100 billion.
Now,
they are right.
Okay.
They have, yeah.
Very briefly, you're only 34 and you've been advocating for climate change, steps to be taken. How do you want, in summary, how do you want people to know that this is important?
Yes, thank you so much for that. Through my organization, that is Climate Change Kenya, and also through a consultancy firm I'm working with, that is EED Advisory, I've been trying to create awareness through the government institutions and also the local people communities living within my area. Specifically, my community have been affected by the impacts of climate change. I've been trying to create awareness in terms of not keeping too many livestock, because livestock have been known to emit methane, which is one of the most potent greenhouse gases. Right now, I'm encouraging the communities to embrace the use of biogas so that the cow dung that is generated from the livestock can actually be used in a much more sustainable way, reducing the release of methane gases in the atmosphere.
Mr. Koimburi, thank you very much for talking to us. Kinyanjui Koimburi is a scholar in agroclimatology and energy expert and founder of the Climate Change Kenya organization. He joined us via Skype from Nairobi. Would like to hear what you think about Africa 54, but still to come, a profile on a member of the African diaspora who is making a name for himself in U.S. politics. But first, here's Hedy Adams to tell us what's coming up on Wednesday's Straight Talk Africa.
On the next edition of Straight Talk Africa, we'll explore the multiple waves of the global African diaspora. Diasporan communities are found in nearly every part of the world. But how has their connection to the continent changed over generations? We'll also profile young diasporans making their mark in American politics. Be sure to join me, Hedy Adams, on the next Straight Talk Africa.
The different diaspora groups that make up the United States inevitably have battled for representation through the voting process. VOA is profiling a group of emerging politicians with direct ties to Africa who are changing the face of American politics. One is Oye Olewa, whose parents hailed from Nigeria.
This is Dr. Oye Olewa. I live in Washington, D.C., and I'm the first Nigerian American elected as U.S. representative. I took my oath of office on January 2nd in front of the Martin Luther King Memorial in D.C.
Preserve and protect and defend the Constitution of the United States and the District of Columbia Home Rule Act.
Everybody who was with me from day one was there. My younger brother, who's my best friend, who also served as my treasurer, my right-hand man, they were able to witness me give my commencement speech to becoming D.C.'s first Nigerian American federal official. I just thought about everybody that got me to this point. My parents, who were born and raised in Nigeria, who taught me about community, about selflessness, giving back to others. Also, all the people who invested in me, whether it's teachers, whether it's my current neighbors, just everything that brought me to that point. It was a very overwhelming experience.
Together, we will fight for change and finally achieve DC statehood.
When I first ran for U.S. representative, it was all about bringing equality for DC residents. Right now, we pay taxes. We pay our fair share as American citizens, but we don't get back what everybody else is. So I was born and raised in Massachusetts. I didn't realize coming into DC, I'll be forfeiting my rights. And there are people who were born and raised in DC who never had the rights that our neighbors in Maryland and Virginia have. My other message was being a representative to people who share my perspective. The Nigerian Americans, the millennials, Black people, Muslim Americans, anybody who sees themselves fighting to see themselves represented, I shared that voice, and that's what I bring to the lawmaking process. USA! The Capitol siege had a huge consequence, not only physically for DC, but our spirit as well. It also highlighted the importance of DC statehood, the ability to defend ourselves, create our own laws, create a budget to prevent this from happening again. Unlike other representatives of other states, this seat is a non-voting, non-seated U.S. representative. So I don't get any federal funding or a budget for my office. So because of that, I still continue my day practice as a healthcare professional. And what that has done is inspired me to also focus on healthcare just as much as DC statehood.
So it's the first shot of 2.
So once I'm able to become a seated voting member of Congress, I'm going to work on changing our healthcare system, make sure it's fair and affordable for every American. Being a healthcare worker, I really believe that there's an opportunity for me to educate the community about vaccines, especially the COVID vaccine.
My name is Dr. Oye Owoliwa, U.S. Representative. I'm working with the mayor's office to make sure people are vaccinated. Have you gotten vaccinated already?
I hear a lot of lawmakers saying trust the science, but being a healthcare provider and elected official, I feel like I have the perspective and the opportunity to really educate the community on a mass level. And it's really good to do your part and make sure that the country is safer. And I believe getting vaccinated is a step to making our country safer and ready to open again.
All right, guys. And like I said, thanks for doing your part to get us past the pandemic.
Thank you.
And if you know anybody else who needs to get one, they can do the same thing. All right?
Awesome. Thank
All right,
you.
guys.
My family back in Nigeria and extended friends, they are extremely proud of this accomplishment. This is the first time a Nigerian American has been elected to such a position. And they see this as not only as a win for me, but also an opportunity for the younger generation to get more inspired in the political process. And not even just Nigerian Americans, but just people from all the diaspora. Because we come here, we excel academically, we achieve a lot, but right now there's not a lot of political capital in our communities. So this is an opportunity for us to really get involved in a lawmaking process. But as a black man as well, I feel like this is also an opportunity for young black people to understand that this is our opportunity to take our energy in the streets and bring it to a lawmaking table. This is an opportunity to really be involved in the solutions of what's going on in our community and just make life just a little bit more comfortable, a little bit easier for the next person. And that's an opportunity that I take very, very seriously.
Tomorrow, in our Elected in America African Diaspora series, we'll feature Esther Githui-Ewart, a Minnesota state representative, so be sure to join us. COVID-19 case numbers in Africa dropped by 35% in September. Nearly 1,800 deaths were reported across 34 African countries in the same period, according to the World Health Organization. The Ugandan government loosened its anti-coronavirus restrictions as the COVID-19 transmission rates declined. For more insight, Africa 54 technology correspondent Paul Ndiho spoke to Dr. John Mundaka, an obstetrician and gynecologist at SEBI, a small private hospital that's leveraging technology to provide medical care to COVID-19 patients in Kampala, Uganda.
John Mundaka, welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you, Paul.
We've been dealing with this COVID pandemic as a consultant working for a medical facility in Uganda. What are some of the most challenging things you've encountered during this period?
As a facility, we've been attending to a very highly densely populated community that can't afford most of the medical services. And the facility came in handy to offer most of the services at low costs. However, the treatment partners for COVID, the requirements for treatment are already at a high cost, finding it that most of our patients could not afford. So we had challenges offering the services at the expected low cost for the community. We were hit with a high demand of oxygen, and the supply in the country was down at a very high cost for the little that we could get, and yet we were determined to offer our services to our community at the lowest possible cost.
Despite the challenges, you guys have been able to get up every day, go do your jobs, and do it at the highest level, or perform at the highest level. What keeps you going?
Well, the selflessness and the commitment to serve to our community that has a huge demand. Most of the communities we serve are our friends, our relatives, our neighbors. It so happens that we are in a community where we've grown up. This hospital has been constructed with support of very many members, Hinga. The CEO himself is a doctor, a colleague of mine called Dr. Seville, who is born where the hospital is. So what pushes us moving is that we can't go away from serving our own. The demand is there. Some of them are relatives, so they have come, and we have found ourselves not being able to send them elsewhere.
How much overall did new technology play in you guys staying afloat during COVID? A lot of hospitals, even here in the United States where I am, struggled. To this day, they're still struggling because of the overwhelming numbers of people who showed up. A lot of them died as a result of not getting the medical care or the treatment that they deserved or wanted. How did you approach it on your end from the resources that you had at your disposal?
The COVID crisis came in at the time when we had transferred from a small facility to a new facility that we want to again add a voice to appreciation of Hinga Uganda, that managed us to build a hospital with an advanced technology, the technology that had monitors, the technology where we had pipelined oxygen flow, and we had also a different computer to help us with the health management system. So that, in a way, helped us to create an isolation unit for the highly infectious patients, away from the other usual patients we've been attending to. It also enabled us to use a limited number of oxygen cylinders, but supplying to a number of beds. So you find that, yes, the technology helped us coming in timely to offer the overwhelming demand of service.
Your relationship with Hinga, where do you see this relationship between you and this technology firm taking you?
The partnership comes in a way that it's going to allow us offer the need or the service that is required by the community, which is really very underprivileged or low privileged. There are very few centers that can carry on services like CT scan services in our community. Actually, there are only about 2 or 3 in the community that we serve, and in the community of Nansana, we're going to be the first to offer that demand that is required. We want to appreciate the platform that has been offered to us by Voice of America. Helps us to discuss our challenges and help us to invite a number of different partners and support from the different communities to our low underprivileged community in Africa, Nansana community in Uganda.
Thank you so much.